Well,
Vicki and I are doing this now, not from Chicago, but from Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we were privileged to be a part of the celebration of the life of Dean Lewis. We celebrated his life about 2.5 months after his death, but on his 95th birthday, which was September 6th, and we did that at Ghost Ranch, New Mexico. Others of us on this call are in Alaska, Mexico, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, and Quebec. So, wow. So, I know that Dennis will be watching later. Our new visitor to Edgewater, Shosky, had a conflict tonight. He'll be tuning in on YouTube and who knows who else. So what we're going to do tonight is just kind of review. Oh, Cindy McWilliams is joining us also from Chicago. So we have 2 Chicagoans for all of us who are all over North America and Central America. Anyway, as a kind of review to get us caught up, because we've been away from each other now for a few months, I want us to think about the significance, the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth from the vantage of Marcus Borg, who in 1987 wrote a very interesting book called Jesus, A New Vision. Let's let this be kind of a summary and getting us back up to speed for what we were studying in May and June, but from a very interesting vantage point, which is that of the late Marcus Borg. He says that Jesus of Nazareth provides us with a way of seeing reality that's very different from and yet more comprehensive than the modern American vision. Jesus of Nazareth provides a model for being human that's at sharp variance from what we understand being human is about. He divides his book into 2 sections. The 2 sections are Jesus and the Spirit, and the second section is Jesus and culture. So we'll start with Jesus and the Spirit. Jesus and culture is coming later. Terry knows this because he read the book in the last few months. There it is, right, an advertisement. Borg says that the context for Jesus' life was the Spirit-filled heart of Judaism. Jesus was a Spirit-filled person in the charismatic stream of Judaism. All that he was, all that he taught, all that he did flowed out of his own intimate experience of the world of spirit. Now, to say the world of spirit is to talk about another dimension or layer or level of reality in addition to the visible world that we know in our ordinary experience. The notion of an other world is pretty alien for modern Americans.
Again, how we get
so I would not expect for those, Sam, like yourself, who have known another culture such as Africa, in which the spirit world can be very real and very palpable. Would that not be fair to say?
Yes.
Right. So we're talking mostly among European American, North Americans who have not had the privilege of that, but in every culture before ours, the world of spirit was seen as being more real than this world. Indeed, this other reality was the source and the ground of this visible world. But these worlds intersect, and people who experience that other reality frequently and vividly can often become mediators from that other world to this world, mediators between these two worlds, because they know the world of spirit firsthand. Jesus of Nazareth unquestionably is a mediator between these two worlds, and Christians would be inclined to say he is the definitive mediator. But for postmodern American Christians, it takes a bit of an intellectual leap at the onset. But if we're going to take Jesus seriously, we're going to have to take seriously this world of spirit. So I hope you have a Bible nearby. This would be a good time to dip into it and to dip into Mark chapter 1. Mark 1, verses 9 through 11. And when you get there, Mark 1, 9 through 11, you'll find where we are is at Mark's quite succinct account of Jesus' baptism. In Mark, Jesus appears on the stage of history as an adult. And this very first episode is a breakthrough from the world of the spirit. Something impelled Jesus to go to see a wilderness preacher of repentance named John. And as he was being baptized by John, he has a vision. It's very tersely described in Mark chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. What does Jesus see? What does it say? Are you there? He saw the heavens, what? Torn apart. He sees another world breaking in, and he sees the Spirit descending on him. Okay, you're in Mark. Go to Luke. Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, verse 12 is one of many accounts in the Gospel according to Luke of Jesus at prayer. The Gospels portray Jesus as a man of prayer, regularly withdrawing into solitude for long hours of prayer. These are probably not, he's talking. He's in the realm of the Spirit of God, in the presence of God. 6:12 in Luke is just one example. And there's a portrayal of an intimate communion with God, so much so that Jesus uses this most unusual Aramaic word, Abba, for God. It's the word that very young children would use to address Papa. Okay, we're still in Luke.
Get a little closer to the mic.
Yes. This is one of the difficulties of being on the road. How is that? Is that better, Liz?
That's better, yeah.
Okay, all right. Go back 2 chapters. Let's take a look at Luke chapter 4, beginning at verse 18. You know the story. This is Jesus beginning his public ministry. He begins it at his home synagogue. He reads from Isaiah 61. And you see in Luke 4:18 and following what it is that he feels he has been summoned to do. Preaching good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, you see it. And in verse 21, you see his certainty, and you'll remember the reaction of his erstwhile neighbors. They are put off, offended, want to throw him over a cliff. And Borg comments from the beginning, Jesus' life and mission were marked by an intense experiential relationship with the Spirit. There it is, the Spirit is upon me, of God. He makes a powerful impression wherever he goes. He evokes awe, amazement. His authority is obvious. If you move a little bit further along, Luke chapter 5, verse 1 and following, he summons disciples. And do they say, well, let me think about that for a little bit, I'll get back to you? Do they say, well, I got to figure out what to do with the boat and my dad's counting them on me? No. What does it say? Verse 11. They leave everything and follow. Tremendous command, authority. And Borg comments, mediators between two worlds often become people of power or miracle workers, especially healers. And so it is with Jesus. If you look at the Bible right where it's open now, if you're still there in Luke chapter 5, there you find Jesus as healer. During his lifetime, says Marcus Borg, Jesus was known primarily as a healer and exorcist. Others might argue that, because certainly there is so much teaching as well in Luke and in Matthew, but we see people flocking to him. And so Borg summarizes this first part, Jesus and the Spirit, by saying, Jesus was a spirit-filled person, a mediator of spirit in the charismatic stream of Judaism, who, now we're going to move into part 2, sought the transformation of his own social world. And now part 2 in Borg's book, Jesus and Culture. Let me pause there. Anybody want to pick up on anything, or shall we dive into Jesus and Culture, which is where I think it gets really, really interesting. But pause. We'll move into Jesus and Culture. Jesus becomes a national figure in first century Jewish Palestine. He undertook a mission to his own people in the midst of, and this is something that I think we frequently overlook in our reading of the Gospels, he undertook a mission to his own people in the midst of a cultural crisis, climaxing in a final journey to Jerusalem, Jerusalem was the center of cultural life. This crisis in first century Judaism was brought on by the occupation of Gentile Rome. And before the first century was over, this crisis will result in a catastrophic war with the Romans, which little Palestine is not going to win. And that war with the Roman Empire climaxes in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 CE or AD. This crisis in Judaism, not just a crisis for the nation, not just a crisis politically, but a crisis theologically, a crisis for their identity as the covenant people of God. The conventional wisdom of the Jewish social world was that the Lord God, Yahweh, had entered into a special relationship with this people, a special relationship, a covenant relationship, right? That's what we have been studying all these many months together. This covenant given through Moses at Mount Sinai was to create a set of customs that would contain within those customs regulations for individual and group behavior. It provided a practical guidance for living. You could find it in the Torah, the law of Israel, and all the elaborations on Torah. They knew how they were to live, to be a part of this covenant, this special covenant with the Lord God, Yahweh. So conventional wisdom within Judaism saw reality as organized. You remember this. This is the Deuteronomic historian, remember? Saw reality organized on the basis of rewards and punishments. If you live the way of wisdom, if you followed the path of righteousness, what would that do? It would bring blessing. But if you followed the way of folly, or worse, wickedness, that would bring on ruin, or death, or exile. Well, by the first century, there were two social worlds just in collision. There was this world of Judaism with its rewards and punishments, its God's expectations, but this was the Lord God of all, and they were in league with the Lord God of all, and they were going to do everything they could to stay on the best side of Yahweh. So there's the social world of Judaism. Oh, this is an all-inclusive, all-encompassing world. If there weren't this terrible impediment of the collision with the social world of Greek culture and Roman political power. That's what the Roman Empire brought on. The Roman Empire brought Greek culture, ancient Greek culture. You know, the Greek gods are the Roman gods, just with different names. A Greek philosophy was adopted by the Romans, but the Romans put armor and spears behind it and battalions. So here's Judaism and the imperial Roman force coming into juxtaposition. Rome had conquered Palestine in 63 BCE, and they had ruled Palestine, generally indirectly. They were very clever. They did it through a series of client kings, otherwise known as the Herods. What Roman occupation brought on was not only the struggle with Gentile authority over Judaism, but also some unintended but inevitable conflicts with Jewish law. One example, taxation. Roman rule brought on a second system of taxation upon Israel. That was in addition to the system of tithes that were contained as obligations within the Torah. Well, the combined total of Jewish taxes and Roman taxes on farmers amounted to about 35%. And it was crushing. Now, here's the deal. Roman taxation was inescapable. You had to do it. There were soldiers making sure you did. On the other hand, there was no legal sanction if the Jewish taxes were not paid. And as a consequence, this system of double taxation was generating, in the time of Jesus, a very large class of non-observant Jews, which created a severe crisis for the Jewish social world. In response to the threat produced by Roman occupation, says Marcus Borg, the Jewish social world became dominated by the politics of holiness. I think he's going to put something on the screen that you will see about the politics of holiness brought on by this crisis. Okay, follow along. Well, first, probably what we'll do is, you can look it up or I'll just tell you. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2, it says, "You shall be holy." Why? because the Lord God is holy. What Jesus enters into in his adult ministry is the politics of holiness. It was an intensification of an ethos that had emerged in Judaism after the exile. It was founded on the Holiness Code, which is found in the book of Leviticus, chapter 17 through 26. And the central words declare, "You shall be holy because I, the Lord, your God, I, Yahweh, your God, am holy." And thus God is calling humans to be imitators of God, and God is, according to the Torah, holy. Now, holiness was primarily understood as separation. Especially it was understood as separation in first century Palestinian Judaism. And to be holy meant that you needed to do all that you could do to separate yourself from anything that would defile holiness. And so, in the first century, under this crisis, with Roman occupation and Greek philosophy being brought on by Roman occupation, the Jewish social world became increasingly structured around the polarities of holiness as separation. What are some of those polarities? Clean and unclean, kosher and unkosher, pure and defiled, sacred and profane, Jew and Gentile, righteous and sinner. And this was understood to be the path of faithfulness. And furthermore, this was, under the crisis of Roman occupation, the path of social and religious survival. So, you must be holy because God is holy. So 3 renewal movements emerge in first century Palestine, each of them grounded in the conviction that the essence of God is holiness, each of them committed, therefore, to living a life of holiness understood as separation from that which is unholy. So God is holy. Looking at the PowerPoint or newsprint, or what are we talking about? What's in front of us? What would you call it? The screen share in front of us. And it's in front of you, right? Right? Everybody?
It's a slide. It's a slide.
Okay. So God is holy. This was understood to be the primary attribute of God. Holiness, understood as separation. Therefore, this requires holiness of us. We are to imitate God. So 3 different sects seek to find a way to live this out. The Essenes, remember them? They are the people who withdrew to the area around the Dead Sea, to the desert. They became a hermit community. Oxymoronic it may sound like a hermit community, but they withdrew from society into the wilderness because they had determined, it is not possible to be holy as God requires us to be and stay within ordinary society. We had to leave. There's another group, the Pharisees, who believed it was possible to be in the world, but not of the world. It was possible to be holy while staying within society as long as they would strictly observe Torah, strictly observe the law. And their major sanction for those who did not strictly observe the law, for those who were, quote, sinners, was social ostracism. Have nothing to do with those who could defile you, who are themselves at risk of being defiled or are defiled. And in particular, this separation, this social ostracism was by a refusal of table fellowship. This ringing some bells? Because we're going to be introducing what is it that Jesus brings. It's not exactly going to be this, is it? A third movement was the Zealots. They were the resistance. They were those who were willing to take up arms to revolt against Rome. But each one of these, see, God is holy. Holiness is understood as separation. We need to remain separate. The Essenes were going to leave. The Pharisees were going to be strict in our observance of the law. The Zealots were going to fight back. The politics of holiness, I'm still with Borg, well, I'm with Borg the whole time, also informed the large number of Jews who were not members of any one of these three groups. But this was a cultural dynamic that was shaping the society as a whole. God is holy. We need to be holy. It's really hard to be holy under the thumb of the Roman Empire, but we're going to work at it because that's what God requires. The theology, the ethos, and the politics of holiness combined with that economic pressure toward non-observance that heavy Roman taxation brought on to so many of the people, what that did was it produced a large group of sinners who were non-observant, who were not staying holy, and therefore were outcasts. So this is a part of a crisis that is going on as Jesus is going to enter the scene. It also, all of this intensified the conflict with Rome, which in 70 CE led to catastrophe. Okay, that's the setting in which Jesus carried out his ministry and his mission, this social crisis over against which Jesus founded an alternative renewal movement. We're not going to do any screen share right now. We'll bring the second one back shortly. We can just be all in gallery for a little bit. Vicki will do that. So Jesus was a teacher. He was a teacher specifically of a way of transformation. His teaching involved a radical criticism of this conventional wisdom that we've been talking about here. Rewards, punishment, kosher, not kosher, Jew versus Gentile, and so on. Jesus' image of reality was quite different from the conventional wisdom of his day, and furthermore from today's conventional wisdom. Modern Western culture tends to image reality as essentially indifferent to us. But Jesus saw reality as ultimately spirit, and what distinguished him from most of his contemporaries, as well as from us, was his vivid sense that reality was ultimately gracious and compassionate. Why is this? Well, interestingly enough, in Luke, I'm out of order in my manuscript here, but I want you to take a Luke chapter 6, verse 36. It's very interesting. Find it, Luke chapter 6, verse 36. Because we just cited something in Leviticus, and when you see Luke 6:36, you'll see this is a very different take. It says, are you with me? Luke 6:36, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Now, do you remember Leviticus 19:2? You must be holy because the Lord your God is holy. Here is, you must be merciful because your Father is merciful. God is essentially gracious and compassionate. You know the stories in Luke chapter 15. If you want to look up, do so, but you know them. There are three stories in Luke chapter 15. They are the stories of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost boys, the prodigal son. And the image of God that's implicit in every one of them is why he tells the stories. Why he tells the stories at the beginning of chapter 15 is that Jesus is getting criticized by the people who were living the politics and ethics and religion of holiness from eating with sinners. He's getting with outcasts. And we find that what Jesus teaches is an explanation of what it is that Jesus does. His character and his instruction and his deeds are all of one piece. And Luke 15 is these three parables, lost sheep, lost coin, lost children, in which they're saying, what are you doing with bad people? You know, you're supposed to be holy. Don't be with bad people. To be with bad people is to be defiled. No, he says, I'm with lost people. And God is primarily merciful and compassionate. This is not to say that God is not holy. This is to say that no, but God's primary attribute as we understand him and as God comes to us is mercy and grace and compassion. Whenever you say that God's love depends on you're first having met some requirements, whatever it is, whenever you do that, you're abandoning grace as the dominant image of reality. No matter how much the language of grace may remain, if you see it, yeah, but you really ought to do this, and God requires that before you're going to gain favor, you've given up on mercy and compassion. If we see reality either as hostile or as indifferent or as judge, then the first law for us is to preserve ourselves, self-preservation. That if we see reality as supportive and nourishing, then another possibility, another response in life is possible, and that is trust. Jesus as teacher contrasted a broad way and a narrow way. The narrow way is the way of transformation. It involved, in Jesus' teaching, a new heart. What matters is what's on the inside, not the externals. The Pharisees are always looking at the externals. It's a new heart, an inner transformation. It calls for a centering in the Spirit of God. This is a whole book's worth, right, Terry? I mean,
yes.
Right? I mean, you got to go on for 300 pages to get this. So if your eyes are glazing over, join Terry and get the book and read it. You'll find it's worthwhile. Jesus's teacher also centers in the Spirit, in God. What mattered was the orientation of the self at its deepest level. He talked about a radical choice between two contrasting centers which competed for the loyalty of the heart. No one can serve two masters, he says. You can't serve God and mammon. So he spoke of and he lived radical trust. And his teaching also involves the way of the cross. It was a metaphor until it became a reality. It was a metaphor for an internal process, a dying to the self, myself as the center of my concerns, a dying to the world as a center for my security and for my identity. What he taught and he lived was a handing over, a surrendering, a letting go, a radical recentering in God. And he taught this and lived this to the uttermost, leading then to the cross. Vicki, we're getting ready for the next screen share as I say that Jesus founded a new revitalization movement. Now, in the politics of holiness, we see the movements, the attempts of the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Zealots, a way of living truly into the holiness of God. But Jesus' revitalization movement, which was also for the renewal of Israel, was radically different from what you see in the left column. Because the heart of Jesus' movement was And Borg is always eager to say and is, because he's not just talking about there and then, he's also talking about here and now. The heart of the Jesus movement is compassion. Because, says Borg, and I think we can find some evidence of this in the Gospels, notably in the Gospel of Luke, the essence, the essential attribute of God is graciousness, compassion. And if God's primary attribute is mercy, then it requires that we be merciful. It requires that we be compassionate in imitation of God. You see, now I'm following the right-hand column. So Borg then proceeds in his section on Jesus and culture to talk about the Jesus movement then and now. Okay, we already looked at Luke 6:36. You are to be merciful because God is merciful. And the issue isn't whether God is compassionate or holy, but concerned with which of these is the central paradigm for imaging God, and which is the central paradigm for portraying what the life of the faithful community is to be. It's not to say God's either holy or compassionate, but which is the primary attribute and the primary path. And Borg's contention is that the primary path for Jesus is that God is compassionate. Take a look at Luke 10, beginning verse 25. Or for that matter, if you don't want to thumb your way through the Bible, I'll tell you what we're looking for there. It's the parable of the prodigal son. Whoop. No, it isn't. No, it's the parable of the Good Samaritan. A parable in which holiness and compassion are contrasted. You see it? Think of why is it that the priest won't stop? Why is it that the Levite won't stop? Well, there's somebody by the side of the road who he's got some real problems, and if I touch him, I might get defiled. He might be unclean. This problem by the side of the road may be an illustration of the judgment that came upon him because of his uncleanness. And so I pass by on the other side. The politics, religion, and ethos of holiness as exemplified in Jesus' story by the priest and the Levite. The Samaritan, and isn't it interesting that he chooses a Samaritan? Because frankly, we don't like Samaritans. We don't like them at all. They're half-breeds. They're not of us. But his hero is a Samaritan, and the Samaritan cares, shows compassion. And what is Jesus' final word? If you're on Luke 10, you'll find it in verse 37. And would somebody who is there read aloud verse 37?
While he was speaking, can you hear me?
Yes.
While he was speaking, a Pharisee invited him to dine with him. So he went in and took his place at the table. The Pharisee was amazed to see that he did not first.
Nanny, you're not reading in chapter 10, verse 37.
Then these pages stick together.
Oh, okay.
And,
well, let me read it. Okay.
Yeah.
So he asked the question, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the lawyer says, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, are you with me? What did he say?
Go and do likewise.
Go and do likewise.
Likewise.
Go and do what the person who followed the way of compassion did. Take a look at Luke chapter 13. Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Here's a controversy because Jesus has the audacity to do an act of compassion, an act of healing on a day in which you're not allowed to do any work. See it? It was the Sabbath. If you're following the theology, ethics, and politics of holiness, you know what to do in the Sabbath. You worship and you rest, and you do not work, like works of healing. And he's criticized for it. But you follow the right-hand column, and if you understand God primarily to be compassionate, and we are called to be compassionate, then of course you see someone who is in need, and if the Sabbath, but there's someone in need, and you can help, and so you do. And he's criticized. Well, there are lots more examples. As for instance, when Jesus quotes Hosea 6:6, God desires mercy and not sacrifice. Quotes that in Matthew 9 and Matthew 12. But the point is that for Jesus, the work of the compassionate Spirit took precedence over the demands of holiness. Just as God is moved by and feels with the least of these, so the Jesus movement was to participate in the pathos of God. Indeed, the pathos of God as compassion was to be the ethos of the Jesus movement, and ideally, as they were seeking to be a renewal movement for Israel, to be the ethos of Israel. So the Jesus movement, says Borg, lived a politics of compassion, which stood in sharp contrast to the relatively rigid social boundaries between righteous and outcast, man and women, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile. And we see in the ministry of Jesus that these boundaries are negated by the Jesus movement, the negation pointing to a much more inclusive understanding of the community and call of the people of God, of Israel. So examples of the politics of compassion. Now we're following down the list on the right-hand side. Characteristics of the Jesus movement. Banqueting with outcasts. And when he did eat with sinners, as clearly he did and was criticized for it, it shattered the social world, which pronounced that these people are unacceptable. The table fellowship of Jesus called into question the politics of holiness. It was an extraordinary action for a religious figure in the Jewish tradition just to choose to be with people that everybody knew were violating all the commandments, like tax collectors and prostitutes, and probably those who couldn't pay their taxes and so didn't, and thus were out of compliance with the expectations of the temple. Second characteristic, association with women. Borg, I'm quoting, rigid boundaries between men and women mark the world in which Jesus lived. Conventional wisdom is typically male-dominated. There was a synagogue prayer that was recited at each service that went as follows: "Blessed art thou, O Lord, who hast not made me a woman." Whoa, whoa.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And it's against this background that Jesus' behavior is extraordinary. He treats women and men as equally capable, equally worthy of dealing with sacred matters. And the sight of a sexually mixed group traveling throughout the land with a Jewish holy man had to have been provocative. Good news to the poor. Jesus challenged the connection between righteousness and prosperity that the conventional wisdom made. You know, if your life has been blessed, obviously you've been really good. If you're poor, well, obviously you've done something wrong, or somebody before you have done something wrong. You haven't lived right. And here's Jesus in Luke saying, "Blessed are the poor, and blessed are you who hunger now. And also, oh, by the way, woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation." Wait a second, wait. We're rich because we're good people. They're poor because they're bad people. He turns it upside down, as, by the way, did his mother in the song known as the Magnificat, opposing the conventional wisdom. Look at these two columns. They're very, very different. And then Borg goes on to say, and I think he's stretching it a bit here, but I'm reporting on his book. He also, his movement is the Peace Party. He speaks of loving one's enemies, with a clear implication that this would encompass the non-Israelite enemy, including the Gentile occupiers. And there are illustrations in the stories of his having not only friendly relations with a centurion here or there, but even does a healing for a Roman centurion's child. Anyway, Marcus Borg's conclusion: the Jesus movement was countercultural, though within the tradition itself, it was another interpretation of the very same Torah tradition. And we can probably eliminate the screen share now. Jesus sought to transform his social world by creating an alternative community structured around compassion, with norms that moved in the direction of inclusiveness, acceptance, love, and peace. An alternative community with an alternative consciousness grounded in the Spirit. My guess is you recognize some parallels in various interpretations and ways in which churches in our experience live out what they understand faithfulness to be. Could I pause there and see if you're making any connections? Isn't it interesting that often Nana's commentary is a laugh and you know exactly why she's laughing? Comments in addition to laughter?
Well, I was immediately struck reading this book about culture and how Jesus presented an alternative culture within his social context, and how, for example, in ours, we're dominated by radical individualism rather than any kind of social good. And immediately comes to my mind is, I'm not going to wear a damn mask because I not giving up any of my freedom. To heck with if I infect a lot of people or whatever.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of works righteousness in church experiences as we have seen them and as we have even known them. And a works righteousness says that we've got to merit God's love by living into God's expectations for a fulfillment of the law, as over against the other column, which is to say, look, no, you didn't earn it. And by your works, you may have disappointed me, but nevertheless, I am merciful and have love for you. And come on, you can do better, but I love you. It's a different take. I mean, the Protestant Reformation was all about that, in which Luther just could not bear the works righteousness expectations of the medieval church and offered that we are all sinners and we rely on the grace of God. Let me wrap up a little bit of Borg and we'll see if we have some more conversation. Jesus' story reaches its climax as he goes to Jerusalem to make a final appeal to his people at the center of their national and religious life. He was not simply a victim, but one who provocatively challenged the ethos of his day. He was killed because he sought, in the name and power of the Spirit, the transformation of his own culture. He issued a call for a relationship with God that would lead to a new ethos and thus a new politics. For that goal, he gave his life, even though that was not his primary intention. The conflict between Jesus and his opponents was between two ways of being that run throughout history. One way organizes life around the security of the self and its world. That which killed Jesus is still alive in human history. The other way of being organizes life around God. It was Jesus' own concern to transform his culture in the name of the Spirit that caused his death. But, Borg goes on, but the story of Jesus does not end there. Death could not hold him. We cannot know exactly what happened. He entered into another mode of being. Suffice it to say that he who was put to death because of his passion to transform culture in the name of Spirit was not swallowed up by either death or culture. Indeed, Spirit triumphed over culture. Borg's understanding of Jesus confronts us at a lot of different points. As a person of spirit, Jesus is a vivid challenge to our modern notion of reality, which is little more than practical atheism. As a teacher, he challenges all systems of conventional wisdom, whether secular or religious. As a renewal movement founder and prophet, he points us toward an alternative culture which seeks to make the world more compassionate. And then Borg being Borg, he won't leave it there. These are potent themes for our times. The claim that there is really a realm of spirit is both exciting and oddly disconcerting. What if reality is other than we ever dreamed it could be? The historical Jesus, with his call to a counter community, with a counter consciousness, challenges our culture. Our quest for fulfillment seeks satisfaction through greater achievement, consumption, and enjoyment. Our blindness and idolatry are visible in our willingness to endanger the planet to preserve our way of life. What does the Jesus movement look like today? Images of Jesus give content to what loyalty to him means. The vision of Jesus as a person of spirit, deeply involved in the historical crisis of his own time, can shape the church's discipleship today. For us, as for the world in which he lived, Jesus can be the light in our darkness. End of a book worth checking out if you are inclined. Jesus, A New Vision by Marcus Borg, copyright 1987. Comments? I'm done for now. Let's talk.
I find the most challenging part of this, I could understand more easily how in our time we're about, there's the challenge of an alternative culture. The more difficult part for me in this book is to think, what does it mean to talk today about a world of spirit? And as you pointed out, our culture is kind of unique in the sense that that's not just taken for granted. And therefore, I feel like there has to be new eyes on what's it mean to talk about the other world. In this book, he kept talking about the other world. You didn't mention that phrase. You talked about spirit. But I think that's a big challenge for us, how to be a mediator between the material world and the spiritual world, or whatever. Anyway.
Yeah. Terry, thank you. Indeed. It went by really fast, but I said that one of the conclusions from this book is that, and I think Terry's elaboration spells out more, that we kind of tend to live our lives with a practical atheism. It's all up to us, and that's just the way it is. It's all up to us. And by the way, in its being all up to us, we're not doing very well, are we? Everywhere you look.
Parker Palmer called it functional atheism.
Functional. Get on camera,
No, I don't
Vicky.
need to.
Functional atheism.
Functional atheism is what
Yeah.
Parker Palmer called it.
Yeah, it is hard to affirm the world of spirit in a postmodern world, the one in which we live, an industrial, scientific, technological world. Even though every day when I read the headlines, a prayer comes to mind, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy.
Kyrie eleison.
Yeah. Anyone else?
And thinking of what you're saying is like, we can do something about it. And it seems to me in this last year and a half, I'm more aware that we can't do anything. It seems like we're controlled by some really strong things like COVID in Afghanistan.
Global warming.
And I was thinking too of the Jews in Masada, and I don't remember their final prayers before they committed suicide, but the response to the Romans. And as you talked, I'm thinking about what was so precious to them that they had to die.
I just want to add something that I experienced recently. I have become fascinated with the history or the existence of fungi, the fungal threads that live under the earth and connect and weave a web. There's a wonderful book about it called Entangled Lives. And I was listening to a friend who happened to be a priest as well, talk about a sacrament is the outer sign of an invisible grace. In Alaska right now, mushrooms are popping up everywhere because we've had so much rain. And the mushrooms suddenly became for me this outer manifestation of a hidden grace. Under the earth are all these fungal threads that are holding things together. They have been here since before life as we know it was on the planet, The things I read there are going to be here after we do away with our planet. And they keep reminding us that they're there as they come up in the fall and show us there's life down there and it's providing more life for all of us. So I don't have any trouble living in a spiritual world in the material.
What a wonderful metaphor and reminder that we can easily become very shallow in what we see and not seek to be spiritually discerning of what additional factors may be at work that are more subtle than to be seen at superficial and preliminary glance. But it does call for trust, hope, maturity, and faith, doesn't it?
Nan's story there, it strikes me that understanding the other world in the midst of this world, it's not some other place. It's what we have to see, but most of us overlook it. That wonder of the mushrooms or that wonder of these things. How do we pay attention and recognize that which, you know, reveals the mystery of life? And anyway, I feel like that's a part of our challenge in this day.
And I encourage anybody, next time you walk down a city street and the sidewalk, look out for the grass and the dandelions and what we call weeds cracking up through the concrete. They're still there reminding us that there's more going on in the world than is controlled by our commercialism and our paving over the planet.
Well, thank you for the engagement. Let me just reiterate that a primary message of this book and a primary challenge that Borg sees, and I think that definitely the author of the Gospel according to Luke sees, is a significant contrast between the theology, ethics, and politics of holiness as separation and the theology, ethics, and politics of compassion and inclusion. And it can be seen in Jesus' ministry, and may not be a bad point for us now to use as an embarkation into our now moving further into the New Testament. Next Wednesday, we're going to go to the first 9 chapters of the book of the Acts of the Apostles. 9 chapters, probably something you can read in a week. And it will take us to Jesus' ascension, to the story of Pentecost in chapter 2, to the introduction of leadership within the burgeoning Christian community, including deacons, and a named deacon by the name of Stephen, who gets introduced and then disappears from the scene under the watchful eye of somebody named Saul, who then becomes known as Paul, and off to the races we go. Acts chapters 1 through 9, and we'll pick it up there. And many others of you will be back in town tomorrow, and we'll see you Sunday. Good night.